John Bush here with the Live Free Now show, bringing you news, views, tips, and tools you can use to live a free, balanced, and abundant life. This is a brand new program, and I'm super excited to be doing it in partnership with Some Next Level Shit, the Some Next Level Shit Network. There's a whole slew of amazing artists and activists and hosts that are going to be bringing some shows for your inspiration, entertainment, and your enjoyment as well. So what's the Live Free Now show going to be all about? Well, we are going to be covering news, insights. We're going to be on the scene in many places, and I guess the whole goal is to encourage you to live free now. In all sorts of different areas, not just living politically free, but living financially free, and I think most importantly, living spiritually and free of demons and that inner voice that's always running its mouth in your head. And we're going to have some regular segments on the show. Among them are the Sustainable and Autonomous Communities Initiative Spotlight. That's a project of the Center for Natural Living, 501c3. Essentially, the mission is to visit sustainable and autonomous communities, again, sustainable, regenerative, off-the-grid, eco-village type setups, but also we're going to explore political autonomy, like Cheran in Michoacan, which we're going to spotlight on our first program. We're going to visit these places. We're going to learn about these places. We're going to do research. We're going to interview the people that live there, and we are going to learn more so we can hopefully educate and inspire you to live a life that's more in line with our nature and more in harmony with Mother Earth. And we're also going to be visiting some of these places and educating them and learning from them as well. Additionally, we are going to bring you the Health Freedom Report. I run Brave Botanicals, which is a sponsor of this program. We do high-quality kratom, CBD, and soon we'll be launching some superfoods and some other products. Super excited about that in the new year. But essentially kratom helps people with pain, relaxation. There's other strains that are good for energy, anxiety, depression. We offer really high-quality stuff. We have excellent customer service, which I can attest to because I run the company and answer all the customer service calls. But check that out at mybravebotanicals.com. But I'm way into health freedom. I was even before I started this company, and it's extremely important for me, for people to have access to natural medicine, plant-based medicine, and it's just so egregious, and I feel really angry when the government prohibits people from accessing plants. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. Well, on the Health Freedom Report, we're going to be bringing you news and views and activist updates in the arena of health freedom, from cannabis reform to examples of tips and things that people can do to boost their immune system in the wintertime, all that good stuff. And on today's Health Freedom Report, we give you an interview with Heather Fazio. She is the director of Texans for Responsible Marijuana Policy, a new organization. They have a huge coalition, and she's been doing a lot of great work. So we get an update on the cannabis legalization front from her. And then finally, the third segment, there could be more segments. This show is going to grow and evolve, and eventually I want to have a nice studio set up and super cool equipment and stuff, but I've done podcasts and programs and radio shows almost my whole life, well, for the past almost 15 years now, and almost 10 years now, and it's just a passion of mine, and I've been wanting to do it more and more, and not everything's ideal and perfect as it should be, but we're just plowing forward. We're not going to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we're bringing you this program here. So we may add more segments, may not, I don't know, but the third segment we're going to be bringing you regularly is called Brave New You, and essentially it's going to focus on self-improvement, spirituality, finding peace and balance in your life, finding harmonious relationship with others, finding center and balance and groundedness within ourselves, and also entrepreneurship as a way to find balance and prosperity in one's life. All right, for the first part of the program here, we are going to focus on the Sustainable and Autonomous Communities Initiative Spotlight on Cheran, Michoacan. If you've been following along, I have been spending some time down in Acapulco, Mexico from October through mid-December. I was down there with my family, my lovely partner Rebecca, and we had one heck of a time. We were enjoying the beach, enjoying the community, the amazing food, the amazing affordability, just soaking up the Mexican culture. We're also doing some great work as well on my company and on the nonprofit Center for Natural Living. And we had the opportunity to drive back. We flew down with my kiddos, and then we drove back with Catherine, the mother of my kiddos, her partner Paulo, and me and Rebecca and Stara and Bill. And we had the awesome ability to stop through Cheran in Michoacan, one of the most violent states in Mexico. Cheran is a town, a small city of 18,000 people. And in 2011, this amazing community of people overthrew the local police, kicked out all of the politicians, and they did this in response to the local cartel groups that were illegally logging their forest, their bosque. And of course, the forest has been an integral part of their community and their culture, going back many generations, back to the indigenous people that occupied the place before. The cool thing about Cheran, I should say, is that it's many indigenous people that are still there. And Michoacan is just, there's a lot of mountains and big hills, and they have remained relatively uninfluenced and untouched by both the Spanish conquistadors, although they did take over and have some influence, but not as much as in other areas. And I even did some research and found that the folks in Cheran were able to push back the Aztec Empire, which I thought was pretty impressive. So you have this community with these deep-rooted ties and family ties in the same space. And for a while, as in most of the rest of Mexico, the cartel groups and the gangs were working in conjunction with the local law enforcement and the politicians. And they were extorting people, they were kidnapping people, they were abusing people, they were humiliating people, and they were cutting down the trees. They were cutting down the trees to take them out to sell them to other communities. They were also clear cutting in order to create space to grow avocados. And the people were just fed up with it. And after years and years of abuse and missing persons, and they had a curfew in the community, people weren't able to go out after dark, and that must have been terrible for business. It was a really bad situation. They finally had enough and said, basta ya, which means enough is enough. And really, it was the women and the children that rose up first. It was just such a blessing, and I feel so grateful that we were able to go and visit with these community leaders. We sat down with a gentleman named Santiago, who's the president of their comité, which we'll talk about here. Not only did they overthrow the local police and kick out the politicians, but they created their own system of governance, which is actually a throwback to their indigenous form of governance, which was based on direct democracy and consensus. Really incredible stuff that they are doing there. We're going to be sharing some video clips and some excerpts from some of the footage that we captured. And later on, we'll be creating a full episode of our Sovereign Living series, documenting our experience in Cheran, Mexico. But it was the women that started this uprising, and this what do they call it? Levantate, like getting up, standing up, and they were fed up with it. The cartels would take the logs that they had just cut down in trucks through routes throughout the town. And one day the women organized, they gathered in this town square. We're going to show you a clip of that. And they set up a barricade and big rocks and blocked the trucks. And then the community pulled the truck drivers out of the trucks. They took their logs back. They were angry. They smashed up these trucks. It was quite the experience, I imagine, and it was so great to be in that spot. So we're going to play a clip for you right now of the little church square courtyard where this all took place.
This is the Calvarium where the people start to reunite. And this street was the street where all the big trucks full of trees was going up and down. And then this is the original place where the rebellion begins, where the people start to rebel against all the men that was going on.
Aquí es donde comenzó todo el movimiento, la lucha. Aquí es donde las mujeres decidieron parar a los carros que bajaban del monte con la madera. Aquí los pararon y aquí se empezó a juntar la gente para
Just super cool to be there with these community leaders and people that took part in the uprising. We later did, or actually before that video, we did an interview with like 8 community leaders, including some of the women that were there for the original uprising and the men that were there. And it was just, we did a whole hour-long interview. We'll be bringing you excerpts from that in the future, and we'll be cutting it into a nice little polished thing. I speak Spanish, más o menos, hablo español, so it was good to have a translator there, but Paulo was there also. He's Italian, which is a closer language to Spanish, but we've really been picking up the language pretty well being down in Mexico so long. You really have to immerse yourself in it. After they showed us that area, they took us up the road and we actually drove into the mountains and the forest, and we got to experience what it was like where they would cut down the trees, and they're letting the forest regrow naturally, which I think is absolutely amazing, but they're also doing some reforestation efforts. And later on that afternoon, they took us to this facility they have where they're regrowing the pine trees, and they just have these massive greenhouses, and they're popping them out and planting them all over. They also collect the sap, which is, again, the forest is extremely important to them. They collect the sap, and they turn it into like turpentine, so you can use for cleaning products and stuff. They actually export it to Japan and China, which I thought was absolutely incredible. There's not very many small towns in Mexico that are doing that type of stuff. But let's play a clip for you. It turns out that the straw that broke the camel's back was was them taking out the forest, the trees, and the logs above this ancient indigenous that was used by the indigenous people, this spring. And the spring had fed people for generations and generations in this community. And when they started logging above it, turns out that the water was starting to dry out. So we're going to play a clip from the forest.
Es el que abastecía a toda la comunidad anteriormente.
Anteriormente, sí.
Over there. This is where the water is.
Yeah. This is like the spring water coming from the ground, and when they start in this area, the loggers, the legal loggers, is when the women raise up, because this is a very like special place for the whole community, and like historically was the place where the community was coming to take the water to drink. This was the
He was
place.
just telling me that before the movement and the uprising, the people of Cheran wouldn't come up here because the malos, the criminals, controlled this territory. And ever since they overthrew the cartels and the corrupt, crooked government, the people returned to the forest, and it's peaceful up here. And people can utilize the forest. Earlier we saw a gentleman that was coming up to collect the resin and tree sap, which is used to make products and health products that they sell at the market and that they use for natural health. I can't begin to tell you how rich this experience was to hang out in this amazing community. It was so peaceful and tranquil, and there's children just running around playing in the public square, and there's markets, and everyone's out and about. You could sit down, of course, at the food vendors. It was incredible. I imagine it's a big contrast to what it was before they rose up. Now let's talk about the political autonomy and the government that they formed. So they overthrew the existing municipal government, and they instituted a new form of government where essentially they divided the town into 4 barrios, 4 neighborhoods, and once every 3 years they hold what's like elections. I should also add that political advertising is banned in the community. And coming in and out of the city, there's 4 entrances and exits. They have checkpoints, armed basically militia, the community police, which is comprised of people in the community, making sure that there's not contraband, there's not criminals coming in, there's not gang members, and they're also checking for political bumper stickers, because whenever the presidential elections are going on in Mexico, you cannot have any political signs or any political party affiliation in Cheran, which I think is absolutely cool. In the interviews, they spoke a lot about how that creates more unity and cohesion. There's not division amongst the families and the community because they support this particular party, they support the opposition party, which I thought was incredible. So they split the town up into 4 barrios. Once every 3 years, they call for these meetings The meetings take place where everyone comes out from the community. They have massive participation. Almost everyone participates, and they nominate. They take turns nominating people. They give like a 3 or 4 minute speech about why they want to nominate someone. And then that community, that barrio, the neighborhood, chooses from their own people that live in their area who's going to be on the town council, which I think is like 8 people or so. You have to be 45 years or older. You serve a 3-year term. And the town council oversees the local police force, the militia police, the community police, called Comunidad Rotunda. They drive around in their own trucks, and they like hijacked all the stuff from the local police. And they oversee the reforestation efforts. And lately they've been working on economic growth and encouraging some economic activity and entrepreneurship. It's awesome in Mexico, the level of entrepreneurship that's there, and the mom and pop shops and the children that are participating in the family business as well. It's absolutely incredible. And I should mention, this is an experiment of anarchy in action, of autonomous government taking place, of a true people's government, self-rule. It's incredible. I should mention, some people will be like, well, what's the crime rate like? How are these community police actually working out? The crime rate is way lower than anywhere else in Mexico. Michoacan is one of the most dangerous states in all of Mexico with the highest murder rate per capita. And in Cheran, that is not the case. I believe one of the statistics I saw said that they had like 9 murders since 2011. So that's 9 murders in 7 years. That's a lower murder per capita rate than here in Austin, Texas, the great progressive bastion, Austin, Texas. So I thought that was absolutely incredible. And the reason, I mean, the only crime that there's like petty crimes. They told me that there was 1 carjacking that took place since 2011, and they were able to recover the car. There's drunken, disorderly conduct, bar fights and stuff like that. But other than that, it is chill and everyone feels safe. And it's absolutely incredible, the dichotomy when the people rose up. And one thing that's really cool and interesting about Mexico is governments all over the world are corrupt. And I think in the United States, people that are watching this program probably already are well aware of that. But I think the U.S. does a better job of disguising it, and a lot of more people are in the dark, the Republicans and Democrats that are just go along to get along, normies as some people call them. But in Mexico, everyone you talk to knows that the local police and the government, the federal, state, local governments are all corrupt. That's just the way things are. And I think it's absolutely inspiring and makes me feel optimistic about the future prospects for liberty, not just in Mexico, but all across the world, that so many people are beginning to stand up, and it's happening in a small, decentralized, bottom-up way. It's not a massive national revolution that's taking place in Mexico. It's taking place locally with indigenous peoples that are standing and rising up. Now, and again, this was an awesome experience. We went there as part of the Sustainable and Autonomous Communities Initiative with the Center for Natural Living, centerfornaturalliving.org. Rebecca's been doing a lot of great work to get this organization off the ground. We're going to be continuing to bring you some of the videos and interviews and some more polished production of what we learned there. But some of my takeaways, I believe one of the reasons why this uprising was able to be so successful and why their government has so much cohesion now is because the people in Cheran share a common bond of their indigenous background and their ancestry. There aren't really outsiders in the community. It's not a boiling pot or just people from all sorts of different walks of life. It's very homogenous, right? I know people in the alt-right community are like, we want a homogenous, all-white, Western European culture, right? Well, this is something that happened naturally and organically. There wasn't external influence, and there's not a whole lot of mestizo blood, right? So originally it was all indigenous, Aztec, Inca, Mayan in Mexico and Central America, and then the conquistadors came from Spain in 1521, and they conquered Mexico, and now all of a sudden there's this mixed race called mestizo, where it's Spanish, Western European, it's European blood mixed with Mexican blood, and you could tell the different looks that a lot of people have in Mexico. There's lighter skin, and interestingly enough, it's the lighter skin, higher bloodline mestizo Europeans that run the federal government, of course. But that's not the case in Michoacan as much, and especially in Cheran. And I think this cohesion, this common bond, enabled them to to rise up and to stay together after the uprising. Because oftentimes when the existing infrastructure and institutions are overthrown, it creates a power vacuum. And more often than not, it seems like there's something, a more worse situation takes place. So I wanted to juxtapose that with the situation in the United States of America, where it is a melting pot, it is a boiling pot. There's not as many common cultural backgrounds. Now, there is one thing that a lot of Americans, not even a lot of Americans, actually, to be honest with you, but that tie to that rugged individualism and American freedom, right? A lot of times it's a freaking fraud, to be frank. So I don't know what it would take for an uprising of the Cheran sort in America. I think really before people take the risk, they risk it all. They risk their lives. They risk their property. They risk their position in the community. Before people, most importantly, they risk their lives. Before people take those risks, things have to get really, really bad. And I think for like African American populations and poor folk here that were being abused by the police, things were getting real bad. That's why we saw the whole Black Lives Matter and all the protests throughout the country. Although that seems like it's kind of fizzled out. So things would have to get really bad in this country. And unfortunately, there's so much division, which is why it's so great in Cheran that they kicked out political parties. Because right now, there's so many Americans that are fighting one another, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, Clinton, Trump, so on and so forth, even though damn libertarians are fighting each other on Facebook and stuff. That didn't exist in Cheran. And so I think in order for the conditions to be ripe for uprising and autonomous government here, self-rule in America, things are going to have to get a lot worse, and people are going to have to set aside their differences and focus on their common problems. Not fight against each other, but fight against the man who is responsible for the oppression, the harm, the wars, the crony capitalism, and all that good stuff. Now, when I say politically autonomous in Cheran, it's not 100% sovereign. It's not a sovereign community. They are still under some authority from the state of Michoacan and the federal government. Now, the federal government has recognized them as an indigenous community, which gives them certain rights and privileges. They still kick up some taxes to the state of Michoacan as well. And I believe, I didn't get in, we went to breakfast with some of the community leaders, and we went to dinner afterwards. It was amazing. We were able to really pick their brains. And I believe one of the taxes that they have is a land tax. Not even a tax on the improvements on your home, but it's a land tax. Maybe like a Henry George style thing, a Georgism, which is just strictly land tax, the amount of land that you have, and doesn't penalize you for putting improvements. And so while I'm all for no taxation, and some people would say this is an anarchist government, an anarchist society in Cheran, it's not necessarily anarchist. They do have some hierarchy, and there is an institution chosen by the people that holds some authority. Now, I should say that one of the reasons why it makes it unlikely for this institution to be corrupted is because they have very little power. There's not a bunch of regulations. They're not in the pockets of all of the businesses, and they're not a nanny state whatsoever. So it's like, why would they even try to take it over in the first place? What benefit? There's no ability to corrupt. Obviously, there is opportunity for that, but I think it's highly unlikely. So while it's not completely 100% sovereign, it's not completely 100% anarchist, it's a great example of a people coming together and having a truly direct democracy government. Now, if someone didn't want to participate, I imagine they'd still have to pay taxes and such, but I think this is a wonderful example of how people can overthrow an external institution that doesn't represent them, that doesn't have their values in line, and instead exercise some self-rule and some self-governance. Really cool stuff happening in Cheran, Michoacan. We're going to be doing some more work. We want to meet with the community again. We want to do some surveys to see how we could help the community out, and check out anarchapulco.com. Some of the leaders from the community, some of the original folks that participated in the uprising, they're supposed to be sending like a delegation of 40 people to the Anarchapulco conference in mid-February. So definitely check that out. If you're going to be going to the conference, you'll definitely want to participate in their talks, and we're hoping to continue to work with them and to continue to build some bridges. So this has been our Sustainable and Autonomous Communities Initiative Spotlight on Cheran, Michoacan. Again, that's a project of the Center for Natural Living, centerfornaturalliving.org. And for this week's Health Freedom Report, we are joined by Heather Fazio. She's the director of Texans for Responsible Marijuana Policy here in the great state of Texas. And we're going to chat to her about cannabis reform and the latest and greatest and activism here in Texas. Thanks for joining us, Heather. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Good to see you, John.
Cool. Why don't you start by just telling us how you got involved in cannabis reform? What inspired you to take part?
Well, at the time, I was involved with an organization that we both hold dear to our hearts, Texans for Accountable Government, which worked on building broad coalitions based on single issues and really focusing on community values that help to bring our neighbors together. And now more than ever, that is incredibly important considering how politically polarized we are. And in 2012, when I was executive director of TAG, I started working with Texas Normal. I've been a supporter of the work that they were doing, and I started working with them in kind of a consulting and advisory capacity and helping them with getting into the Capitol and communicating with lawmakers about the ills of prohibition and how there's a better way forward. From there, I was recruited by the Marijuana Policy Project in 2013 while working for the Libertarian Party of Texas, and started full-time on marijuana policy in the spring of 2014, where we went on to build Texans for Responsible Marijuana Policy, a broad coalition of organizations working to advance sensible and compassionate marijuana policies.
Cool. Yeah, I was checking out your website. What's the URL, if you could share with us?
TexasMarijuanaPolicy.org, where you can find more information about the organization we're working with, our coalition partners that span the political spectrum, and our priority policies that include reduced penalties for low-level possession and bringing patients safe and legal access to medical cannabis.
Cool. Yeah, I checked out the website. I was pretty impressed with the number of coalition partners from a diverse background. Do you want to share with us what you think the importance of having these transpartisan coalitions is, and maybe share some of the partners that you're excited about?
Yeah. Well, you know, we're obviously grateful to be working with the folks who have been active on this issue for many years. All of our great normal chapters, Marijuana Policy Project, groups like the ACLU of Texas, but also bringing into the fold more conservative organizations like the Republican Liberty Caucus, the 10th Amendment Center, which is a states' rights organization. We're working with the Young Republican Federation of Texas, very conservative young people who know that this policy is something that can unite people in Texas and is the right political move when it comes to conservative values. So we're thrilled to see all of these people coming together on an issue upon which they agree. In this case, marijuana is bringing people together. It's really a beautiful thing.
Cool. Yeah, it brings people together in more ways than one.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us, mentioned the 10th Amendment Center, and it seems like the federal prohibition on cannabis is obviously a violation of the 10th Amendment, which states that those powers not delegated to the federal government should be left to the states and the people, respectively. Tell us about this States Act. Is that what it's called? I understand there's something that could potentially be passed through Congress that would give more power to the states in this regard.
Well, we've seen increasing pieces of legislation introduced at the federal level and, of course, in all the states throughout our country. At the federal level, though, where the success has been is amending the budget in depriving the Department of Justice of access to resources to enforce federal prohibition.
Nice.
And that's been enforced since 2014. It's been renewed in every budget, and we're grateful to see fewer raids happening. We're grateful to see more research happening finally, and it's because of that restriction. But what we really need is comprehensive legislation passed at the federal level that removes cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act, a place it never should have been to begin with, especially Schedule I alongside heroin. It's absurd. People know that it's absurd, and finally people are starting to catch up to that. We need to remove it from the Controlled Substances Act and allow states to decide how they want to enforce marijuana laws. We have so much more power when we decentralize, when we work within our own states to create policies that are in alignment with our own values. And that's what we'd like to see. The States Act is a great example of bipartisan legislation at the federal level that would do just that. It allows conservatives, whether or not they support cannabis at the state level or not, it allows them to take a states' rights approach, that there is no constitutional backing or authority for the federal government to prohibit a plant that is objectively safer than alcohol, tobacco, and many of the pharmaceutical drugs that the FDA regulates and are prescribed to patients every day. So we're looking forward to this new era of criminal justice reform in general. We've seen the signage of the First Step Act, which is wonderful, the Farm Bill, which for better or worse, there are a lot of ugly provisions included in that legislation, but within it, it legalized cannabis across the board with the exception of one cannabinoid, and that's THC. Of course, we have work to do considering the therapeutic value of that component of the plant, but we're seeing a really historic movement happening across the country, and Texas is no exception with our state level momentum for policy changes.
Cool. Well said. If you could point to one or just a couple of factors that you think are responsible for the big shift that we've been seeing in the past decade or so when it comes to people's perspective and view of cannabis, what do you think, what are the factors that have enabled such reform to take place all across the country?
Hands down, the number one factor from my perspective that's helped with moving this issue along is access to information. Access to the internet, access to dialogue with our neighbors like never before, whether they're around the corner or across the state, across the country, around the world. We're able to communicate effectively about the facts about prohibition, the facts about cannabis. And while it certainly isn't a substance that's safe for everyone all the time, it's important that we understand that the falsehoods that have been purveyed by our own government has been lying to us about the harms of this plant. And when it comes to access to medicine, for using cannabis for medicine, it is unconscionable that we have been depriving people of it for so long. And now we're at a point where people are seeing through. They're seeing the man behind the curtain. They're seeing the facts on this policy. They're communicating with people now more than ever, reaching out for support, and now being more emboldened than ever to share their personal stories, whether it's a loved one that's using cannabis or wants to use cannabis because it's helping someone in another state, or they have professional experience as an academic or as a former law enforcement, coming forward with the courage to share that experience with lawmakers and with their communities. And that's what's moving the ball forward, is the courage that people have now because they're better informed and they're better connected with their community.
Yeah, there's something that is especially frustrating for me, and I feel anger about it, and that's the government denying access to medicine. It seems just so much more egregious than, firearms rights or standing up against the IRS, for example, when it's just something that's completely natural and helps so many people. Let's switch focus here to Texas, which is your stomping grounds and where you are most active. What do you think is one of the biggest hurdles in the past for cannabis reform here in Texas? And what are the best talking points to speak with some of these conservative lawmakers? I understand the medical aspect of it is extremely important this year.
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is stigma and stereotype, and overcoming the misperceptions that a lot of legislators and other community members may have when it comes to thinking about cannabis and those who use cannabis. Typically when you see, the B-roll in a news story, you're seeing someone, lighting a bong in a park. And that, while that exists, most certainly, there are more people using cannabis that are everyday average Texans. And by them coming forward and communicating with lawmakers about their need for this medicine, or about how they have been done wrong by the justice system, so-called justice system, that's enforcing prohibition, we're able to help to overcome that. So the professional efforts at the Capitol, the honest, true heart-to-heart stories that people are sharing with legislators is really making a huge difference to overcome that stigma and overcome that stereotype. A lot of folks, they just have been they've fallen victim to the propaganda that's been perpetuated by our own government, the reefer madness era nonsense that's gone on for decades, and people have grown up in that. It's become ingrained in them, and we have to help to overcome that by opening their hearts so they can open their minds on this issue.
Yeah, I think it's a great example that makes me optimistic for the future prospects for liberty, that it was so much easier to propagandize and to program previous generations when the only source of information they had was the local newspaper or the local news report on the radio or television. But nowadays we have access to so much information, so much credible scientific research, that it makes it a lot harder to pull the cover over the eyes of the public, which is great. And I also appreciate how so many people are seeing through the veil of legitimacy that government purports to have with this issue, because it's so obvious that cannabis is not unsafe. It doesn't harm people. In fact, it really helps and benefits so many different people. Will you get us up to speed on the legislation that's on the table in the state of Texas?
Sure. Well, we have two priorities. One is reducing penalties for low-level possession, stopping the bleeding when it comes to prohibition. Texas arrests between 60 and 70,000 people annually for the simple possession of marijuana. Not trafficking, not distribution, but the simple possession of this plant. In 2017 alone, it was 66,000 people. And according to DPS numbers, 2/3 of them were finally convicted of a criminal penalty of a drug offense. And that means that they not only were they arrested and facing 6 months in jail, $2,000 in fines, but 2/3 of them, it was over 41,000 people in 2017 that ended up with a permanent criminal record for a drug offense that comes along with lasting collateral consequences. A driver's license suspension for 6 months, the license to carry, your right to self-defense, suspended for 7 years in the state of Texas, not to mention hindered access to education, employment, housing, occupational licensing, which is a whole nother story, but still, all of these things are affected for a lifetime with a criminal drug conviction. And we're seeing year after year, tens of thousands of people falling victim to these poor policies. So we'd like to make a change by instituting, rather than criminal penalties, a simple citation. You pay your fee and you go along with your life. You don't end up with that lifelong criminal record. Chairman Moody, who's a former prosecutor from El Paso, has introduced a civil penalty bill the last 2 legislative sessions. This is our 3rd crack at it, where we've been building bipartisan support for this kind of policy. In fact, the governor came out in September during a live televised debate calling on the legislature to look into reducing penalties for low-level possession. The Republican Party of Texas included in their platform a plank that calls for a civil penalty. So we're seeing increased bipartisan momentum going into the legislative session, and I'm very optimistic about us being able to reduce penalties so we can eliminate those collateral consequences, as well as save valuable criminal justice resources. Shifting gears into the medical side of things on medical cannabis. In 2015, the legislature passed the Compassionate Use Act, which allows access to those with intractable epilepsy to access to low THC cannabis. And while this program is unreasonably restrictive, it was historic in 2015. The legislature of Texas acknowledged that cannabis is in fact medicine, and they began licensing businesses and regulating the production of cannabis as they do with many other substances. And right now, just miles from me here in Austin, Texas, cannabis is being grown and being delivered to patients with intractable epilepsy. We've worked hard to make this program more inclusive and are looking forward to the opportunity we have in 2019, building on the momentum that we built in 2017, where more than half the House of Representatives signed on to legislation that would have added to the list of qualifying conditions, removed the arbitrary cap on THC, a very therapeutic component of the plant, and fix some of the fatal flaws with the compassionate use program that don't protect doctors. We need to see those changed, and we also need to see independent laboratories allowed for consumer protection. We in Texas taxes and regulation are bad words in Texas, and I'm a Texas girl. There need to be reasonable regulations in place. That's understandable, but there's room for the market to self-regulate, and that comes with independent third-party testing, offering accountability for consumers when it comes to the products that are on the market.
Wow. Okay. It seems like the civil penalty bill might be a low-hanging fruit that has a real chance of passage. And, as a philosophical and practical anarchist, it's like gives me a little tension in my stomach, but I do understand that we need to, when it comes to legislation and lobbying, we need to think practically. And that seems like a low-hanging fruit that would enable a lot of the conservative lawmakers to save face and not just willy-nilly say that cannabis is okay for anyone to consume. But I think practically speaking as well, it would really help a lot, especially poor, underprivileged, marginalized communities, African Americans and minority groups who are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement and get put into the system. And it just has sometimes generational effects that are really hard to undo. So I think that that would definitely help marginalized communities especially, and that would be great to see something like that passed. On the medical front, do you think there's a chance that one of the compromises would be just to add THC as acceptable instead of just the CBD and very low amounts of THC? Or do you think maybe the route would be to add more conditions to the list of approved conditions? And also, do you think there's a possibility that just full-on medical could come to life here in Texas?
Well, there certainly is a great chance that a full medical program that puts Texas on par with the now 33 states
Wow.
that allow safe and legal access to cannabis, there's a great chance of that passing. As I mentioned, more than half of the Texas House, 78 members, including 31 Republicans, strong bipartisan support in the House, signed on to the bill, not just promising to vote for it, but signed their name to legislation that would put Texas on par with the other states. So we're going to carry that momentum into the legislature and, of course, push for that kind of medical cannabis program. But there are going to be, and already are, other proposals that would do a little bit less. And we're going to push for more and try to bring Texas along to catch up with, what's not new. This has been decades of medical cannabis being available to Americans in other states. More than half of Americans, I think it's actually close to 70% of Americans now live in a state where they have access to medical cannabis if they have a debilitating medical condition.
Wow.
And so we're looking forward to pushing hard for that. But there are other proposals that will just add a few qualifying conditions or that would ignore the lifting of the cap of THC. And that's where we come in. THC has been made into this boogeyman for some reason when we know that many medications have psychoactive effects on patients. And that's why we have labels on the bottles. We make sure that patients are consulted with their doctors and medical professionals so they understand the side effects that these medications can have. We trust them and they have a responsibility to not operate heavy machinery and drive under the influence. All of these things are already happening with other medications that are far more dangerous and addictive. And cannabis, including THC, should not be an exception. So we have to overcome that misinformation that they have, somehow compartmentalizing the psychoactivity of cannabis with the psychoactivity of, Xanax or opiates. We have to do that, and we have to also demonstrate the therapeutic value of THC. One study that I always bring to legislators relates to Alzheimer's, and a report that was issued out of the Salk Institute right here in the United States that showed that not only does cannabis help, including THC specifically, it mentioned in the report, stop the progression of the disease, it actually starts breaking up the plaque in the brain and reversing the effects of Alzheimer's, something that no pharmaceutical drug on the market can do. That is the value of THC. In addition to helping more people with seizures than CBD can offer, helping people with chronic pain. PTSD is an anxiety disorder. For many people, it's THC that helps them to get through the night without night terrors. These are real lives that can be positively affected by allowing them to access the whole cannabis plant, working with their doctors to determine which cannabinoids, which terpenes, which strains of cannabis are going to be the best for their medical condition and for their biochemistry.
Yeah, not to mention the cannabinoids are synergistic with one another. So THC enhances the CBD's effects and vice versa. Really, there's no reason not to have them all and to be so specific, but I guess lawmakers want to save face. Tell us a little bit about the other side of the issue. I saw the broad-based coalition you have on your website. Obviously, the patients, recreational marijuana users want to see this stuff get through. Who is on the opposite side? Big Pharma, the prisons, who's lobbying against this legislation?
Well, you know, in Texas, there's actually very little vocal opposition to what we're doing. It's mostly isolated to the Sheriff's Association of Texas. They've been the only opponents showing up at our hearings for our legislation. And, you know, in 2015, not only did they sign up against the bills, but they testified against them. In 2017, they signed up against them, but didn't testify. And I'm hoping the trend continues, and they just don't show up at all because they finally realized that not only do the people of Texas want to see these laws changed, but they'd have more resources and availability, time availability to actually go after victims, or go after justice for victims of real crime.
Yeah.
So, you know, law enforcement, it's a cultural thing for them. Also, they don't want to give up their ability to search someone's vehicle for the smell of marijuana. Apparently, it's very significant in their ability to apprehend people for bigger crimes. You know, my position on that is there's a lot of real police work that could be done to apprehend, you know, perpetrators and suspects in other crimes rather than by chance you smell marijuana in their car, and how many people's rights are being violated in order for you to achieve that. There's a cost benefit that we really have to reevaluate here. And we have to have that honest conversation with law enforcement. But law enforcement really seems to be the only opposition, and isolated to that one association. We saw CLEAT, the Combined Law Enforcement Association of Texas, just on live TV recently, talking about how they have better things to do with their time, not only on the streets as law enforcement officers, but also as far as lobbying at the Capitol. They're not going to be coming out in opposition to this legislation, which is really heartening to hear. So other folks that, you know, may be opposed to it, often it's just because they haven't heard enough compelling arguments yet. It has only been a few sessions that there have been professional efforts at the Capitol to sit down and have an adult conversation about marijuana policy. People have been rallying against prohibition for decades, and now we're to the point where we're actually having honest conversations, sitting down at the Capitol, talking about how these policies are negatively affecting individuals, families, communities, and our country as a whole. And thankfully, legislators are getting on board because of these effective arguments that people are making about the cost to our justice system, the deprivation of justice to victims of real crime, the deprivation of access to medicines for patients that have seriously debilitating conditions. It's all happening, and it's going to happen at an accelerated rate, not only in Texas, but across the country, as more people feel empowered to talk about this issue with their friends, family, neighbors, and their legislators.
Heck yeah, cool. It's good to see the tide is turning, and I think it'll give the legislators a healthy backstop for there to be such little opposition and so many people that are proponents of the legislation. All right, before we let you go, tell us what needs to get done in order for this legislation to get passed, and how can people participate?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe the most important thing you can do is identify your legislators, where they stand on policy, and connect with them about how you feel about this issue. On our website, we have voting records for legislators, so you can identify who they are, where they stand, which based on their voting records or surveys that they've filled out during our election cycles through our voter guide. And then contacting them. Make sure they know who you are. If you're not super confident in going into it, we make it easy by having automatically populated letters that you can send in. But as you educate yourself more and feel more confident, share those personal stories about your neighbor or your loved one who's using cannabis, or about how your nephew got his student loans withdrawn or his grants withdrawn because of a conviction for a small amount of marijuana. That the law is causing far more harm than the actual plant ever could. Those kinds of personal anecdotes are really helpful in moving forward. In addition to that, we need support and those who can make financial commitments to the lobbying work that we're doing. We know that there's a lot of money in politics, and people that are at the Capitol are there for a specific reason, and we need to empower our lobbyists and our advocates to give them the tools that they need to be there day in, day out during the legislative session to ensure that this issue is on the forefront of the minds of legislators, that this is a priority during the 2019 legislative session. Because if we are not successful this spring, we do not have another shot at this until 2021. And so many patients do not have that time to wait. We have to take action now. The legislative session begins on January 8th, and if you can, contact your legislators before then. You can do so at our website, texasmarijuanapolicy.org, where you'll see legislator voting records on the top tab, and that's going to get you started on your path to advocating for sensible and compassionate marijuana policies in Texas.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing in this area, and thanks for joining us on the Health Freedom Report.
Thank you, John.
And that does it for this week's Live Free Now show, bringing you the news, views, tips, and tools you can use to live a free, balanced, and abundant life. Today, we did the SACI Spotlight, checking out Cheran, Michoacan, a community that overthrew the politicians and police in 2011 and instituted an indigenous form of consensus-based government. And we brought you the Health Freedom Report, interviewing the amazing activist Heather Fazio of Texans for Responsible Marijuana Policy. We hope you enjoyed the program. I want to thank our sponsors, Brave Botanicals. Check them out at mybravebotanicals.com, bringing you high-quality kratom, CBD, and soon-to-be-launched more products, excellent customer service, and they also fight for your health freedom. Again, this is Live Free Now, John Bush. I also want to thank the guys at Some Next Level Shit for making this new network possible. John Bush, peace and freedom. I'm out.